Shabbat Shalom. So for those of you who were here way back at the beginning of the service, you might remember that I asked you to consider, as we were going through the Shacharit service, the alternation that you get between pieces that require a community, pieces that require a minyan, and pieces that don't require a community, and that can be said by the individual on their own, which begs the question, if these are individual prayers, what are they doing in a community service? Similarly, we could ask, if an individual is saying their prayers, and that counts, then why is it that periodically we're required to come together as community and only certain prayers can be said with a minyan? So that provides a good backdrop, a good introduction to what I want to talk about this morning. I've mentioned already that we read from the chapter Naso, and a lot of commentators, and indeed the rabbi who came here and spoke last week, very beautifully, note the specific Hebrew wording that gives this Torah portion its title. Naso et Rosh, it says. It means lift up the head. It contains within the Hebrew the idea of being recognized. It happens to the butler and the baker in the Pharaoh story, for example. And it happens to Joseph himself when he's brought up from prison. Naso et Rosh. And a lot of the commentators like to interpret those words to mean that special individual attention is given to each person, that each individual, and everyone who is counted counts, is one of the phrases that you hear a lot. I want to suggest that that is a beautiful interpretation, and it might not be the most useful one for us to be hearing, since it strokes a part of ourselves that would do a lot better, in my view, by being challenged. Because you see, we live in an age of unprecedented individuality. I remember when I was probably quite a bit younger than you guys, when I had the idea that I thought was my original idea. Hey, wouldn't it be great if instead of having to buy a long-playing record to get the one track that I want on that album, but to have to push the money out on the whole of the record and have to own the whole of the record? Wouldn't it be great if there was some kind of operation whereby I could just choose the individual songs that I liked and put them all together in a single playlist? Wouldn't that be amazing? We can do that now. We can operate our playlists on our iPhones by personal choice, and we can operate a whole lot of other stuff by personal choice as well. I can go on a site called eShakti, plug in my measurements, and get dresses that are made specifically to the construction, to my own body's construction, customized to within the half inch. And so on and so on. As for the banal, so for the more important. Over and over again, society is reinforcing our idea that our individual choices are what matters, and our individual choices and the availability for us to make individual choices is the only thing that matters. There's been a number of books written talking about this phenomenon. I want to cite from one. It's called The Good Society. It was written back in 1991 by a sociologist called Robert Bellah, along with 4 co-authors. And he asks why it is that within America and elsewhere in Europe as well, institutional life is basically disintegrating. We live as comfortable individuals in a society that manifests the problems of growing homelessness, he writes, rising unemployment, crumbling highways, impending ecological disaster. And we tend to respond to those issues by retreating into our private worlds, putting in our earplugs and getting on with our lives, or perhaps adding every so often a dose of cynicism or frustration or some kind of criticism of other people who are involved in the process. And Bellah cites the reason for this as being American society's dedication and allegiance to the principles of individualism. He says that America believes, and I know it's a generalization, he says America believes that the good society is a society that is constructed so that individuals are free to pursue their private goals independently of other people. And in this book, he understands individualism to be a force that ultimately is a stunting force for society, because it means that people become unable to conceive any goal larger than their individual achievements or their individual possessions or their individual experiences, and the whole of society becomes poorer as a result. Now, we belong to a tradition that disagrees with that idea. Judaism offers a compelling, dynamic, alternative narrative. Because we know, if we think about it, that from its very origins, Judaism has wrestled with the tension between the individual and the community. We think of the words of Hillel, who very famously said, "If I am not for myself, then who is for me? But if I am only for myself, then who am I? And if not now, when?" Getting, in a very pithy little epigram, that challenge of how do we balance the needs and requirements and aspirations of the individual, which can be laudable, with the needs and the requirements of the aspirations of the wider community. And citing that, when I was writing this sermon a couple of days ago, I noticed what I hadn't noticed before, which is that the final line in that little trilogy, "If not now, when?" suggests that there's a degree of urgency for us in trying to resolve this. So what does the tradition have to offer us in terms of this balancing exercise between the needs of the individual on the one hand and the requirements of the community on the other? This is Judaism. It's not going to come as a surprise when I tell you that the position isn't simple. It's actually very deeply nuanced. And of course, we have conflicting teachings. So on the one hand, we have the texts that do support the individuality and the uniqueness of every human being. We're drawn to texts like the one in the Mishnah Sanhedrin, when the judges would bring in the witnesses in a capital case. Remember, under the Jewish legal system, it's the witnesses who carry out the sentence, yeah? So if it's a death sentence, these are the people who are going to be carrying out the execution. And the judges warn them, and I quote, "In a capital case, the defendant's blood and the blood of his descendants until the end of time, all that depends on you. Because it says in the Torah, your brother's bloods call out to me. Not blood, but bloods. This is why there was only one human being created at first, to teach us that anyone who causes a single life to be lost, Torah deems it as if he had caused a whole world to be lost. And if anyone saves a single life, Torah deems it as if he had saved a whole world." And that, end quote, and that imprecation is followed up by an image that you will probably have heard before, which is the idea that when human beings mint coins from the same mold, then all of the coins turn out the same. But because God is God, God minted every human being from the mold of the original human being, and as we can see by looking around the room, we all turned out being different. So that's one set of teachings, that the individual is unique and important. That's underpinned by a second and perhaps less familiar set of teachings in which the rabbis set up a hypothetical situation in which you have two people crossing a desert and only one of them has a bottle of water. Hands up if you know of this example. It's Rabbi Lab, okay? There's only enough water in the bottle to save one person. So the possibilities are that the person with the water should drink it, which would kill their companion, effectively, or the person with the water should give the water to their companion and they should drink it, effectively that's suicide, or they should split the water, even in the knowledge that there is not enough water in the bottle, and then both of them will die, but at least nobody will have to be responsible for killing the other. And that is the original ruling that is given by a rabbi whose first name we don't know. He's called Ben Petura. But then Rabbi Akiva comes in, and he radically reinterprets a verse from Deuteronomy that clearly was not intended to mean this. V'chai achicha imach, and your brother shall live with you. And Rabbi Akiva says what this means is your brother can't live with you if you're dead. and therefore you should be the one to drink the water. Because in this situation, somebody is going to die. But it does not necessarily have to be you. You have a responsibility to stay alive. Yeah? Radical teaching. And a very, very difficult situation. It comes into play again, by the way, when we look at issues like organ donation and so on and so forth. So it's not just a hypothetical. So on the one hand, the individual is important. On the other hand, over and over and over again in the Torah, as we know, we find the teachings that say you must not ignore the community. You must not ignore the poor in your community. You must not ignore the widows in your community. You must not ignore the stranger in the community. Torah is calling on us to deprioritize our personal interests and lift up those of the community in the mix. There's this acute situation in which this came into play for a medieval rabbi, Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg. He was a genius, this man. He was known as the Maharam. And in 1286, he tried to leave Germany and was caught and was imprisoned. And his community wanted to pay the over-the-odds ransom that was being asked for his life. And he forbade them to do it. He stayed in prison for the whole of the rest of his life. He served his community from within prison walls, and it was only after he died, which did finally put an end to his objections, that a ransom was paid by a very rich individual in the community whose gravestone can now be found next to the gravestone of the Maharam. So according to him, at least, the community needs to trump the individual. And we see that in more everyday contexts as well. Hands up if you are one of those people who had a relative die and had your Shiva interrupted by one of the festivals in the Jewish calendar. Yeah. You see, it happens quite a lot. You are in your private grief, you have lost somebody, you are entitled under Jewish tradition to have 7 days of mourning, and indeed an additional 21 days after that to make up a period of 30. But if an event in the Jewish calendar, a public event comes along, then you are expected to stop your Shiva and let the festival take over. And that is indeed a difficult proposition for anybody who is in mourning. There's a similar idea at play in that certain prayers, the Kaddish, the Baruch Hu, certain actions like reading the Torah or giving the 7 blessings to a couple under the chuppah can only be undertaken with a minyan, the minimum quorum of 10. These events in people's lives, and I want to put in here, by the way, the most exquisite example of this, which is the idea that God cannot resist the prayers of a bride. It's a tradition. And therefore, it became the tradition for the bride to be asked immediately before she walked up the aisle to bless various members of the congregation. So notice the beauty of this tension. This is one of the most personal moments in anybody's life. A bride walking up the aisle to meet her husband. What is she supposed to be doing according to our tradition? She is to be holding not her husband, not her family, not herself, not the future that she wishes for both of them, but other members of the community in her heart. And so Judaism teaches us both that the individual is valuable, but I think that the tradition is also teaching that we can only properly appreciate the value of the individual when it is set against the value of the community. So Nasoet Rosh, lift up the head of the individual, yes, absolutely. But the tradition provides us with an antidote to that idea, even within the parasha. If we flip to the end of the parasha, we're going to be reading it in a couple of years' time, we find the 12 princes, one of each tribe, singled out by name, making 12 offerings. Each of those offerings is exactly the same, as any Torah reader knows. If you know one of those offerings, you can read 3.5 columns of Torah, because all the words are exactly the same. And there we have it again, right under our noses. The tension between the individual and the communal, the tension between the self-expressive, the name, and the uniform, the sacrifice. And Judaism constantly challenges us to hold these two in that dynamic tension, to balance the needs and the recognition of the individual and the needs of the community in an appropriate way. In doing that, I want to say that we come from a place that is providing a radical challenge to the norms of the society in which we live, to a society that appears to believe that we can live in isolation. Judaism knows that that is not true. Judaism knows that life is more complex than that. And as we walk out of the services this morning and into the wider community, it behooves us to remember that it's about us, but it's not just about us. Shabbat Shalom.